Okay, this is part 7 of what is going to one day be, in Mr. Shem, a comprehensive series of all the primary sources that deal with the mitzvah of Tzitzit. It's been more than a month now since I made a video, which is lame. The reason is because I was moving house. But enough about that. We have now done all of the halachic midrash, which is to say, Sifrei on Bamidbar and Sifrei on Devarim and Sifrei Zuta. And we've discussed the one issue that can be got out of the way because no other sources mention it, which is the number of strings. And we saw that it's really unambiguous that you're supposed to have one string of techelet. It's now time to move on to the Talmud Bavli. As we've discussed, the only place in the Mishnah, but that's not quite true. The one of the few places in the Mishnah where Tzitzit is discussed explicitly is in Menahot. The next most explicit place is, or equally explicit place, is Masechet Ediot, but there's no Gemara on Masechet Ediot. So the place where everything about Tzitzit is kind of chucked in is Masechet Menahot on the Mishnah over there at the beginning of the 4th chapter. There are other places in the Gemara, Masechet Shabbat, and some other places where Tzitzit comes up, Sanhedrin, and we're going to look at everything in due course. But we're going to first start by going all the way through the extended section at the beginning of what's called Perek Techelet, fittingly enough. There is actually some material on Tzitzit at the end of the 3rd Perek, because both the beginning of the Mishnah in the 4th Perek and the last Mishnah in the previous Perek deal with Tzitzit. But it makes more sense to learn all of this material in Perek Techelet first, and then to go back to the Sugya there, because even though it comes first in the Gemara, as is very frequently the case, it assumes knowledge of what comes afterwards in the Gemara. So, as we saw before, the Mishnah right at the beginning of Perek 4, and you can follow in your Gemara, Safari, or whatever. I didn't bother with a source sheet because it's just one long thing. It starts as follows: Techelet on Daf 38a. Techelet ena ma'akevet es halavan, v'halavan ena ma'akev es techelet. You can have techelet without lavan, and it's still valid, and you can have lavan without techelet, and it's still valid. Tefillah shoyad ena ma'akevet es shorosh, v'shorosh ena ma'akevet es shoyad. And similarly, the same thing works for tefillin. That if you are just wearing your tefillin shoyad or just wearing your tefillin shorosh without the other one, you're still doing something. It's not completely worthless. Now, as we discussed before, this is a big chiddush. Because as a general rule, you'd say if the Torah tells you to do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do Z, then if X, Y, and Z are all part of one mitzvah, and everyone agrees that Tzitzit is just one mitzvah, it's not two mitzvahs, that's if you're missing one component, you're missing the other components. Just like if you're making a cake and you've got, you're missing a flour, well, it's very nice. You can make all sorts of things out of sugar and eggs, and milk and whatever, but you're not going to make a cake. And the classic example is, of course, lulav, whereby if you don't have hadassim, it doesn't matter that you've got the nicest esrog and the nicest ravos in the whole world. It doesn't help you, and in fact, it's not even a good thing to take them because you might get confused and think that that's a legitimate kind of thing to do, and you certainly can't say a bracha, etc., etc. Whereas with tzitzit, it doesn't work like that. That's the chiddush of this mission. And we're going to look basically on, the Gemara starts by analyzing a mission and then goes on by the by, because this is the only place where it's really appropriate to deal with it. Then it talks about all the other things with Tzitzit. We're going to look today just on the first two Amudim, whereby what the Gemara has to say about this mission, which is actually quite surprising. Okay, it starts off with as follows. Lema mathnithan deluka Rebbe. So that's by saying, is it the case? Ask the question, is it the case that our Mishnah doesn't follow Rebbe? Why would it be a surprise that the Mishnah doesn't follow Rebbe? Because as everyone knows, Rebbe was the compiler of the Mishnah. He was in charge. No. Is it the case that the Mishnah always follows Rebbe? Definitely not. But at least it's somewhat surprising. The Tanya, but wait a second, why would you think in the first place that the Mishnah doesn't go with Rebbe? What does Rebbe have to say? Let's look at what Rebbe has to say. The Torah says all the things the Torah has just been talking about, Tzitzit and up till techelet. And that's what it means. Therefore, it has to include everything. Divrei Rebbe, and that's Rebbe's opinion. The Chachamim say no, it's not so. You can have blue without the white. You can have white without the blue, and you still achieve something. My ta'ameh the Rebbe. What is Rebbe's reason? Now you might say that the Mishnah already told you what Rebbe's reason is. But he gives another one. Dichtiv, as it says, hakanaf min kanaf. And this is a Josh that we're going to see come up over and over again. That the word kanaf teaches you that the tzitzit have to be the same thing as the kanaf. Min kanaf. So just as the kanaf is made of like ordinary wool, so also the tzitzit are made of ordinary wool. Ukasiv patil techelet, and it says patil techelet. Well, Amar Rachmana, and the Torah says, Ure'itha Mothor, you shall see it. Ad de'ika tawaihu b'chad. So this is just teasing out the logic of what Ure'itha Mothor says as before. So the Torah tells you, you've got Sisith Amin Kanaf, you've got Techelet, and it says Ure'itha Mothor. You have to have the whole thing, otherwise it's nothing. It's nothing halachically. V'Rabbanan Ure'itha Mothor, you shall see it means called Chad Lechude. Each one on its own. So it's just irreconcilable difference about what Ure'itha Mothor does. According to Rebbe, it means Ure'itha the whole thing, and according to the Chachamim, Ure'itha Mothor kilu v'Othor. Okay. Mashma lema deloka Rebbe. So we go back to our first question. We know what Rebbe's opinion is. Rebbe's opinion is Lechora, not like what the Mishnah says at all. That if you've only got white strings and you haven't got techelet, it's nothing. It's not asa, I guess, to tie some strings to your garment. You can tie strings to your garment anytime you want, but you're not fulfilling any kind of mitzvah by doing so. You certainly couldn't, for example, say a bracha on it. If you were to wear it on Shabbos, under certain circumstances, it might be considered carrying, because it's just like some string that you've tied onto your garment, etc., etc. Whereas the Chachamim say no. So is it the case that the Mishnah doesn't go according to Rebbe? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Afilu Tema Rebbe. You can say, even if the Mishnah does go according to Rebbe, and therefore to fit Techelet and Lavan are Ma'akev on Shabbat, and if you only have one, it's no good. There's no mitzvah in it. You can still explain the Mishnah. What's the Mishnah talking about? Lo nisracha ela lekeden. That's another guess was lahakdin, or maybe it's lekadem. In any case, what it means to say is that the Mishnah is talking not about that they're not ma'akev in each other. They're talking about the order is not ma'akev on each other. The Tanya miswa lahakdim lavan letecheles u'im hikdim techeles lavan yasa. We have another brayso that says it's a mitzvah to do lavan before techeles, but if you did the wrong thing and did techelet before lavan yatsa, and the brayso continues ela shechisa miswa, but you're lacking a mitzvah. Okay, let's stop. What does it mean it's a mitzvah to put white before lavan? So Rashi says that it's a mitzvah to put white into the garment before lavan. And on the grounds, as we're going to see to come, lavan is more kadosh, and we're going to see why that is in due course. But let's just say this for now. So when you're putting the strings into your hole, or possibly more authentically, not into a hole, you're kind of threading them through with like a needle or whatever. You have to put the white in first. But if you didn't do it, you're lacking a mitzvah. Now, that's Rashi's explanation. Tosfos say, how do you know? We don't have any other mention that there's such a concept of, it makes a difference what order you put it in, and how would anyone ever know afterwards? So they say it's going on the time. So everyone knows that when you're tying, you have to start with white, and this is a Mefurish Gemara that comes later. You have to start with white and then go with blue. So according to most Rishonim, that goes on the chulia. So you have to have a chulia of white, then a chulia of blue, and then keep going until you end up with a chulia of white. According to Rambam, it means just the very first wind has to be white. According to Raavad, where you've got alternate windings, it's the same concept as chulias, but with windings, you have to do white, blue, white, blue, white, blue, and again finish with white. So Tosfos say it's talking about that. It's the same halacha as that. In any case, the Gemara asks, "My chisa mitzvah." What does it mean that he lacks a mitzvah? Ilema chisa mitzvah de lavan wakaya mitzvah de techelet l'Rabbi ekuve ma'akev ahadadi. Now, this is more mashma like what Rashi says, even despite all the problems that Tosfos bring up with Rashi's perush. It's more mashma what Rashi says. They say, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to explain the Mishnah according to Rebbe. What do we know about Rebbe? Rebbe says that techelet and lavan are ma'akev. You have to have both of them or you've got nothing at all. And if you want to say he lacks the mitzvah of white and he fulfills the mitzvah techelet, that doesn't help you because the whole point about Rebbe's opinion is you need both of them or you don't get them. So what are we saying? Let's explain like Rashi. We're saying that if you're supposed to put in white and then you're supposed to put in blue, but you actually put in blue and you put in white. So the blue came in the wrong order. So therefore, you could say you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of the blue. Only the white's really valid now because the white has to go first. And if the blue was nothing, then the white is first. It's just you haven't got the blue. It's a bit hard to really say why there's no mitzvah techelet if you, like what Tosfos said, there's just no mitzvah techelet at all if you tied techelet first, because after the white you're going to have some techelet. So it's a bit hard to explain like Tosfos there. But in any case, the point is we're trying to say, what does chisa mitzvah mean? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, same Amoraim as before. What it means is shechisa mitzvah wa'asa mitzvah. Umay chisa mitzvah delo avad mitzvah min amuvcha. Often, Talmudic sources will say it's a mitzvah to do something, and by mitzvah they mean what we in later speech, already by the time of the Amoraim, call a mitzvah min amuvcha, which means the best possible way of doing something. So when the Braita says you're yotze, you fulfill the mitzvah, but you're lacking a mitzvah, what it means is you're yotze, but you didn't do it in the right way. So what have we got to so far? We got to as follows. We're trying to explain the Mishnah, how it can go according to Rebbe. Now, simple pashtus in the Mishnah is it saying the precise opposite thing to Rebbe. But how can you explain the Mishnah is going to Rebbe? When we say that techelet is not ma'akev lavan and lavan is not ma'akev techelet, we mean the order is not ma'akev. And therefore, if you got it in the wrong order, it's fine. You're still yotze. Not chas v'shalom, according to Rebbe, that you can just not use blue at all. But even if you got it in the wrong order, it's still okay. It's not ma'akev. What we're really saying is the order is not ma'akev. But there's a big problem with that. And the Gemara goes on. Hatinach lavan da'ena ma'akev techelet. I can understand the first clause in the Mishnah says lavan is not ma'akev techelet. That is to say, if you didn't put in the lavan first, it's not ma'akev techelet. But what? Wait a second. Techelet da'ena ma'akev lavan. If the whole thing we're talking about here is you have to do white then blue, there's only one way round wrong to get it. Okay, so therefore the Mishnah should only say once lavan is not ma'akev techelet, but it says both way around. But there's only one. If you got an order of two things, and it should be A B, but actually, there's only one way round. You can get it wrong. You can, instead of doing A B, you can do B A. But this Mishnah clearly goes two ways round. Okay, Maihi. So what's it on about? Amar Rami Bachama. Rami Bachama says lo nisracha el talis shakula techelet. Well, that's you need for a talit that's completely techelet. What? The assumption of the Gemara here is that when do you have to put white first? When does white go before lavan? When the garment itself is white. Why? Because it's min kanaf. But if the garment is completely techelet, then min kanaf would be techelet. So therefore, you still have to put white. You still have to put blue, which, by the way, in itself is interesting. But that's taken as a given. You still have to put white and you still have to put blue. But whereas it's normal white would go first and blue second. Now blue should go first and white should go second. And the Mishnah is telling you that if you got it wrong and you put the white first and the blue second, you're still Yotzi. So that's why the Mishnah goes two ways around. One is talking Lavan is not Makiv techelet. It's talking about the ordinary case where white should go first and then blue second, but you did it wrong and did blue first and white second. And techelet is not Makiv Lavan. It's talking about the other case where you should have put techelet first because you're a big gavir and you've got a techelet talith like Kohen Gadol, and instead of putting blue first, you put white first. Itmaname. We have a corroboration for this. Interestingly enough, exactly the same generation. Amar Lewi Lishmuel, Levi, who was the Talmud of Rebbe and a kind of leader of Eretz Yisrael Jewry, and Shmuel, who was kind of the leader of, along with Rav, of Bavli Jewry. He said, Arioch. Arioch seems to be some kind of what's the word? Like terms means like lion, but it's a term of respect. Lo thisev achra acha ad mafar shaf li laha milfa. Techelet eno ma'akevet es halavan, v'halavan eno ma'akevet es techelet. Mahi. So he said, Shmuel, I'm not going to leave you alone until you explain to me what's this Mishnah going on about. Now, why is Levi saying you have to explain to me this Mishnah? Well, it seems Levi has exactly the same problem that was asked by the Talmud Gemara before. Levi's problem is the Mishnah disagrees with Rebbe. How can it be? You need to explain to me how the Mishnah can agree with Rebbe. Amale, he says back to him, Lo nisracha ela lasadim basisif. The misva la'agdume lavan bereshe. My ta'ama, sorry. How kanaf min kanaf. The yakdim techelet lavan les lam be. So he's saying the same thing in different words. But he does add something interesting. But let's just see what he's saying again. He's saying, the Mishnah means as follows. You're supposed to put the white strings in first. Again, we're explaining like Rashi here. But actually put the blue strings in first. And therefore, les lambe. Slightly different. He's not saying chissa, mitzvah, or anything like that. He's just saying you didn't do the right thing, but it's still completely kosher. And that's what the Mishnah means. Now, notice he says, sadin b'tzitzit. Now, I did check the Gearses using the National Library of Israel website, Vatican manuscript, and Munich manuscript, and first to first, and everything else that's available online. Very cool. Sefaria now is starting to upload Kitvei Yad as well. You can look at some of them. Just you go to the relevant part of Safari, you go scroll down to Kitvei Yad on the side on the left, and you can see them, which is enormously cool. And I have a dream that one day, before people make very profound, far-reaching diukim, they'll just check that they're not making profound and far-reaching diukim on a scribal error or a typist error, because obviously they're using the printed version. I have a dream. I think I'm not the only one, but in this case, it's moot, because I did check the Gearses, and it definitely does seem to be that the word sadin should be there. What does sadin mean? Well, sadin in modern Hebrew means a sheet. This is going to be a whole separate video, because there's a whole separate sugya about this in due course. In the Mishnah, sadin also means a sheet. And not even specifically a sheet made of linen, although it is the case that in the absence of cotton, a kind of probably, it does seem that linen was the most common garment, but as we're going to see, if you look carefully, it's reasonably clear that a sadin does not have to be made out of linen. That's what makes something a sadin. However, in the Talmud Bavli, pretty consistently, sadin would appear to be used as something that what defines it as being a sadin rather than not a sadin, some other kind of garment, is the fact that it's made of linen. However, even that doesn't seem to be super relevant to this part, although it is going to be very relevant to another sugya we're going to learn. What seems to be relevant here is that a sadin, you can assume, is white. And therefore, it's certainly true that you should put the white string in before the blue string. Now, Tosfos raised a whole thing about this. It's not really so simple because even if it wasn't white, you should probably put the white string in first. I mean, not if it's techelet. That's a separate question, which we're going to see. But let's say it's just brown or whatever. Either hold you should have white strings, and therefore the white strings go first, or we hold you have brown strings, and the brown strings go first. In any case, it doesn't really, unless it's actually made of techelet, it seems to be obvious that the white strings or the not techelet strings should go first. So why does it davka mention a sadin? But nevertheless, it does, and that seems to be, there doesn't really seem to be any other kind of great significance to why it should mention sadin, except that sadin you can assume is white. Why is sadin white? I believe it's the case that, at least at the technology they had then, it's harder to dye linen than it is to dye wool. So sadin would, as a rule, if it's made of linen, be white. Anyway, the Gemara goes on and it says the same thing. Tinach lavan da'ena ma'akevet techelet. I've understood half of that Mishnah, but techelet da'ena ma'akevet lavan maihi. Again, same question. If you're saying a whole Mishnah comes to tell you it's okay to get it out of the order, but there's only one way to get it out of the order, but the Mishnah seems to have gone out of its way to say it works both way around. Amale Rami Bar Chama, and Rami Bar Chama says, interestingly, sorry, just looking at the note in the Gemara on that. Okay, just the lay possibly shouldn't be there because Rami Bar Chama is a different generation. So it seems that again, the second part of the story where Rami Bar Chama intervenes is kind of the Gemara putting together different layers into one conversation, but actually he wasn't there, and Shmuel only explained half of it. Rami Bar Chama says, "Lo nisracha el latalis shekula techelet." The mitzvah la'akdume techelet b'reshay tahar kanaf min kanaf. It's a mitzvah to put techelet first because techelet is the kanaf. V'yekdin lavan b'resha leslam bei. But if you put the white in first, it's fine. So twice we've had the same explanation. When the Mishnah would appear to say at kind of first look and second look and 100th look, you can have techelet without lavan, you can have lavan without techelet. But what it actually means is you can have the wrong order. And in 99.99% of cases, the wrong order means you put blue in before white. And in the very rare case that someone has a talit that's made of techelet, it means you put the white in before the blue. However, Amar Rava Midi Siva Kagarim, he disputes the premise of the second part of the explanation, Rami Bar Chama's explanation. He says even if it's a blue garment, you still are going to have to put in white first. So we haven't explained the Mishnah. Amar Rava, and Rava gives a different kind of explanation completely. Lo nisracha ela legadum. Now we've seen before in the Sifrei on the Middah, and we're going to see it again in the Gemara that gadumin are kosher. The tzitzit have to be 4 etzba'ot, and again, as we said, some machlokas are shown in, but stam b'shat, it means the entire tzitzit, but it doesn't really matter in here. But gardumin, the remains, if they all fade away, kosher. And he goes on, Di'i igradam techeles v'ka'i lavan, we igradam lavan v'ka'i techeles les lambe. So, when he made the tzitzit, and this actually, by the way, Rava is often associated with somewhat more far-fetched explanations of Tannaitic sources. So Rava was the kind of pioneer of the more distinctively Bavli kind of methodology of very, very close readings that are also kind of creatively reinterpret a source by reading it very, very closely. So you zero in on a word and kind of zero out from the kind of general context, and you can make a source mean something very different from what you would have thought it meant. However, in this case, actually, his explanation is more kind of in a kind of basic common sense way, just more plausible than the previous explanation we've heard twice, both from Rav and from Shmuel. He says what the Mishnah means is when you make the tzitzit, you have to have both, because that's what the Torah says. And that's what Rebbe says. But if it frays away, just as if it frays away, you can have much less than the initial shear. You can just one step further, that even if all the blue's gone and you've only got white, or all the white's gone, you've only got blue, still kosher. And that is, although it's still what you say, not the most intuitive sense of the Mishnah, it's closer to an intuitive sense of the Mishnah than the previous explanation. The Amri b'nei Rabbi Chia, because the sons of Rabbi Chia said, Gardumei techelet kasherim, v'gardumei ezov kasherim. The gardumin, the kind of frayed amounts. Now, again, we're going to look at in the next year actually exactly what these words gardumin means. But the frayed bits of techelet, or the frayed bits of ezov, I mean, we're talking about ezov that you use for the mitzvah of mechatat, the paraduma waters, to be mitaher people who are tummy myth, are kosher. Now that's interesting example of that's actually a Tosefta, and it says in the name of the sons of Rabbi Chia, and it's an interesting example of how things that are in Tosefta as a stam are brought in other sources as statements made by early Amoraim. And once you start noticing that, you'll notice it everywhere, and that is actually part of the reason for the traditional attribution of the Tosefta. But that's another subject for another day, another book. The Gemara goes on, how much does a gardumin have to be? When we said the little bits that are frayed away, what we mean, like, if you can only see it with a microscope, what do we mean? Amar Hamaduri, Amar Shmuel, Kedela Anva. There still has to be enough to tie a bow out of it. Okay, to kind of take the loop and kind of thread it through. Not a bow in the sense that you would make with your shoelaces, because that's actually quite a large amount. I think it just means take a circle and then make a circle and then thread it through. So a pretty short amount. The Gemara goes on. Ibaya lahu. They asked amongst themselves, Kedela Anvan, La Anvan Kule Bahadade, or Dilma Kol Chad Bachad Lachode. If you've got different strings, now it's assuming you need more than one string. So that's something to take note of. Do they have to be long enough, which is going to be a bigger amount that you can tie them all together, or is it enough that each one you could make a little kind of primitive kind of knot out of it? Take it. Don't know. Gemara does not rule on that one. Ba'i Ravashi Alime Dala Me'inve Wa'ihawa Katine Me'inve Mai. You got a very thick string, and because it's thick, as you can verify it yourself, it's harder to bend it around and get it through that hole. But if it was thinner, you could. Then what? Mai. Amale Rav Acha, Berei the Rava, the Rav Ashi, Kol Shekain Demin Kamiswafahu. Very, very logical answer, which is this. Why have we got this shear of being able to make a bow, being able to make a kind of little knot out of it? It's not because there's some inherent significance of making a bow. It's because that's a good way of testing whether it's long enough. And why do we want it long enough? Because you want you to be able to see it. There still needs to, the mitzvah stuff sits it. There needs to be some degree of visibility. And I could give you a length, but they didn't have rulers in those days. So a good way of testing is, can you make a bow? And if it's thick, and if it was thin, it's thick, but it's the same length as if it was thin, you can make a bow. That's even better. We shouldn't puzzle it for that reason. It's more kosher. Why? Because it's more visible. The whole point is it should be visible. So far, that was a diversion. And the Gemara is now going to return back to its topic. But just to recap, the Mishnah seems to say, plain as day, blue is not makov white, techelet is not makov white, and white is not makov techelet. The Gemara's problem is that that disagrees with Rebbe, so it reinterprets the Mishnah, or it provides an interpretation of the Mishnah that will fit with Rebbe, who holds that they are makov. The first one is that the order is not makov, but Rava rejects that on the grounds that, basically it's too convoluted. And he says it means it's talking about the gardumin, that once they've frayed away and you've only got a little bit left, it's enough to only have one, which is still a kiddush. but it's just less of a chiddush than the original, than the kind of Peshat meaning of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara continues, Uman Tana, the Paligale, the Rebbe. Who's the Tana that disagrees with Rebbe? Now you might say, what do you mean? The Chachamim, the Mishnah. Well, we just said, we've just done a lot of work here to prove that the Mishnah doesn't disagree with Rebbe. Well, wait a second, you still had a Baraita that said the Chachamim disagree with Rebbe. Okay, but we want to narrow that a bit more. Hi Tanahu, this is the Tana. We got this Baraita, the Thania. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, Meshum Rabbi Nathan, Sha'ama Meshum Rabbi Yosei Glili, Sha'ama Meshum Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Ein lo techelet matil levan. All this train that goes down all the way to Rabbi Yosei Glili, their statement is, he doesn't have techelet, he can put in levan. Now, obviously, actually, the Mishnah says it works the other way around. You don't have levan, you can just put in techelet. In practice, that's going to be pretty rare. Why should you be in such a situation where you only have techelet string? And you can't find white strings. And that's why, whereas the Mishnah talks about it in a very abstract way, an abstract halachic sense, this is talking in a more metziistic sense, which is that in practice, what's more likely to happen is you have white strings, you have blue strings. Now, what have we got here so far? We had a Mishnah. Before we opened the Gemara, we thought we knew something pretty clearly. While the mitzvah is to have techelet and levan, you could just have techelet, you could just have levan, you still got a mitzvah. It doesn't specify how much of a mitzvah. Is it have you got half a mitzvah? I mean, it stands to reason it can't be just as good as having both of them, but you certainly achieved something. And then we had a whole string of Amoraim who worked to reinterpret this Mishnah so it's compatible with Rebbe. Who do we have? Rav, Shmuel, Levi, Rava, and in addition, Rami Bar Chama. These are some of, obviously, the greatest of the Amoraim. And on top of that, the Stam is going with them, who, despite the apparent difficulties of doing so, reinterpret the Mishnah fit with Rebbe. And not only that, but despite the fact that the Gemara itself initially admits that the Chachamim are cholek on Rebbe, even if it's not willing to admit the Mishnah is cholek on Rebbe, admits the Chachamim are cholek on Rebbe, then narrows that down to actually a specific chain of transmission of Tanaim. And though, of course, Rabbi Yosei Glili and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri are highly Gatanuim, etc., they are, Rabbi Yosei Glili is the sparring partner of Rabbi Akiva, and obviously it's the case that far more often it's Rabbi Akiva's opinions that get incorporated into halacha as opposed to Rabbi Yosei Glili's opinions. So A, it's reinterpreted the Mishnah, and B, it's narrowed down the Chachamim's opinion to Rabbi Yosei Glili's opinion. Mishnah what? Mishnah. As far as Bavli is concerned, you can't wear tzitzit without techelet. Can you tie some things onto your garment? You can tie anything to your garment. You can't make a bracha on it. You can't wear on Shabbos. It's not tzitzit. That's clearly where the Talmud Bavli is trying to lead you. Now, it's important to note here that there's all kind of a lot of fuzziness in accounts you read and online, etc., of when techelet went away. There's not any mention at all ever in the Bavli of them not having techelet, absence of techelet, anyone wearing tzitzit without techelet, anything like that. It is the case that the trade of techelet was restricted under the Roman Empire, i.e., even in the time of the Mishnah, certainly after the Mishnah, and long before the Bavli was finished. And to some extent, perhaps that restricted how much techelet was available in Eretz Yisrael, and perhaps to some extent that even that influenced the halacha in the Mishnah of stating that you can get away without wearing techelet. It seems in Bavel, there's nothing to indicate this was really an issue. Obviously, techelet is expensive, but a mitzvah can be expensive, and if you can't afford it, well, you probably, who says you get to wear tzitzit? Who says, you get, talet's expensive. A talet was in itself a sign of, certain hashivut. Just as, bisman hazeh, if someone says, I can't afford 500 quid for tefillin. People might say, okay, well, we'll do a whip around. People might say, people say all sorts of things, but what they're not going to say is, okay, well, just get some cardboard, paint it black, whatever. Sometimes it's too bad that some things are expensive. It's not really a reason to allow people to not do the mitzvah, to allow people to kind of compromise on the mitzvah. And it seems to be that basically that's if all you had was this Bavli, you would assume that the Mishnah says what it says, and very often the Bavli reinterprets the Mishnah, or you can phrase it however you want. You can say the Bavli provides you with the true meaning of the mitzvah, or the Bavli reinterprets the mitzvah, depending on where you are on that spectrum. But whatever, in this case, as is the case many times, you had the Mishnah, it looks like this is a halacha. The Bavli tells you actually this is a halacha. And it is famously the case that the Brisker Rav, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, would not wear tzitzit on Shabbos. We're going to look at this source in due course, this source on Shabbos, about what the whole issue is in the first place. Why? Well, because you can't carry. And maybe these tzitzit are, maybe these tzitzit are possible. That seems to be what the Bavli says. Yeah, fine, it's not what Moshe Shonim say, but it's possible. So he didn't not wear tzitzit. He didn't even not say the bracha, but potential chiyuv kares is a serious, or chatos, or whatever, is a serious issue. And when he came to Yerushalayim, he didn't use the erev, except he wore tzitzit. That's how I've heard the story. Which is, the point is, he says, the point is, it's a chumrah to not use the erev, a pretty well-based chumrah not to use the erev, and it's also a chumrah to not wear tzitzit on Shabbos. So, and also you're potentially losing the mitzvah of tzitzit. So he relied on the erev to the one extent that he would wear tzitzit on Shabbos. We're just going to look at one more thing. We're going to just look, even though we're not doing that until they're finished, we're going to look at what the Rif says on this sugya. Now the Rif has because Masechet Menahot has this extended section on how to write Sefer Torah, extended section on tefillin. He has here separate kind of halachic sections. Usually he just produces a digest of the Masechta, and you have to know which Masechta to look in to know what the halacha is. And every so often he'll mention something from one Masechta in another Masechta to systematize a little bit. But usually he goes with the Gemara's thing. Here he takes it out and he makes separate kind of halacha books, basically. But it's still in the Rif's basic formula, which is quoting the Gemara, missing things out, and every so often making a kind of editorial interjection. So he quotes the Mishnah. Then he goes on. Tanya, Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, Mashum Rabbi Nathan, Sha'ama Mashum Rabbi Yosef Glili, Sha'ama Mashum Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Ein lo techelet mata lavan. So he missed out that entire sugya, and he just eventually quoted the Baraitha, which says if you don't have techelet, you can wear lavan. Now, everyone knows that the Rif's whole thing is to basically make the whole almost impossible job of mastering the whole Gemara easier by cutting out all the argument, cutting out all the non-halachic material, and just giving you the headlines, what you absolutely need to know. But I think this is an example where you can say, even though he's strictly following the methodology, he's not adding any words, he's not cheating at all, it doesn't really give you what I'd say was the accurate thrust of the sugya. The thrust of the sugya is Amoraim and the Stamad Gemara going as far as possible to basically say, yeah, I know what the Mishnah says, but that's not the halacha. The halacha is you have to wear techelet. You can't just wear white. It's no good. And here, if you just, it's chopped, the whole middle is removed, you just get the beginning and the end. And what it looks like is the Mishnah says, yeah, well, the Mishnah is clear as day. And here's the explanation of the Mishnah. If you don't have techelet, you don't wear lavan, finish, done. Right. Why? Well, I mean, the simple answer is because by the time the Rif was around, for many hundreds of years, there had not been techelet. What was it that actually stopped techelet? It didn't really have much to do with the Roman Empire in the end. It was a consequence of the Arab invasions. Basically, you had these kind of this period where the Byzantine Empire, which was the remains of the Eastern Roman Empire, kind of Christianized, went basically in a kind of, it'd been on and off war with the Persian Empire for centuries and centuries, And basically, both of them kind of decided they were going to try and wipe the other one out. And they had like 50 years of very, very intense warfare, which exhausted both of them. And then, boom, out pops Muhammad with his gang of, excitable Arabs. And in the end, it wasn't Rome knocking out Persia or Persia knocking out Rome. They both knocked out each other, and the Arabs just took the whole region. It was one of the, with only the only other candidate would be the Spanish Portuguese conquest of South America, of just the most kind of rapid expansion of any empire in history. And it was an extremely violent and disruptive time. And North Africa, which we know previously was like the breadbasket of the whole Roman Empire, became what it is today, which is desert. And lots of knowledge was lost. And one of the things that was lost was the techelet. And it's not just some Jewish thing. Roman and Greek sources refer to this porphyra dye, which was then lost and only rediscovered 400 years ago by this sailor who wasn't interested in techelet or anything Jewish at all. He knew about these Roman dyes, and he discovered these sea creatures and worked out that that's what they were. And it was, so therefore, after the Bavli, but not that long after the Bavli, that the whole techelet industry not just collapsed, but collapsed to the extent that they just got forgotten about as part of the general collapse of civilization in the region. And therefore, it's one thing to say, you have to wear techelet. There's no point in wearing tzitzit without techelet. Okay, so it's too expensive, too bad. Another thing saying, you have to wear techelet. Okay, so there's no tzitzit anymore, and there's not going to be any tzitzit for 1,000 years, for as far as anyone knows. And so, despite what the Bavli says, as we've seen, the Rif and all the Rishonim just rule according to the pashtus of the Mishnah, which is that you can wear techelet without levan, or levan without techelet. It is worth, and that may be reasonable enough, and it may be even reasonable enough as Manazeh. I mean, it is worth raising the issue, which is that now techelet has been rediscovered beyond reasonable doubt. Yes, people claim otherwise, but the arguments they raise are really genuinely not reasonable. There is a question: is the shade that's been produced by the companies really right? Maybe it should be a bit darker. Maybe it should have a bit of purple in it. I'm very sympathetic to these arguments, but again, that might be an obstacle to you as a consumer. It's not an obstacle to you as kehilas. If you think it should be darker, just make it. There's a guy in Jerusalem who does it, sells it. Like, I'm sure you could do it. Is it really legitimate to wear tzitzit bisman hazeh when it's not really that expensive certainly it's not that expensive compared to the kind of money people spend on other things, even just an atara or a talis. Yeah, sure, you can't have it's going to be an issue having 25 pairs of stinky tzitzit that your kids change every day. But okay, that's a separate issue whether you should even be doing that. But your talis that you wear, shouldn't you be at least a little bit concerned that, according to the pashtus of the Bavli, you're not even allowed to wear tzitzit without techelet, even if you have some doubts for whatever weird reason. Whatever doubts you have, how could they be more important than being yotze what the Bavli is trying to tell you to do, what Rava thought, what Rav thought, what Shmuel thought, what Levi thought? And I don't really know why this staff of Gemara hasn't been raised more by the kind of techelet proponents. The simple answer, I guess, is because they're all very nice people, and they have a very strong kind of hashkaf of it shouldn't be like Korach, it should be machlokas l'shem shemayim, and it doesn't matter what gets thrown at us, we always have to be very positive and stress the positive and stress the love and the Ahavas Yisrael and blah blah blah, which is good. But I don't know, if someone's on the fence about techelet, instead of going over for the 500th time the sugya of tzad and explaining why it's not really a very convincing argument that, you don't need to trap a snail or whatever, maybe the simplest thing is just to show them this Gemara and say, look, okay, fine, you've got a suffix, but it's a suffix. It's also a suffix whether you're even allowed to wear tzitzit with white. What's the big deal? And what's the big deal about wearing some, whatever big deal you have about maybe this is not the right techelet. You've got to, you should at least try your best. But probably that won't work either. And on that note, I'll end for today.